This three-dimensional model of the Military Historical Museum in St. Petersburg was created from the drawings and sketches of Vladimir Alexandrovich Pokrovsky, outstanding Russian architect and academician of architecture, one of the initiators of the Neo-Russian style at the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, and an expert in Old Russian art. Pokrovsky was educated at the St. Petersburg Academy of Arts and is famous primarily as the creator of structures in the Russian style and a number of major public buildings, including the State Bank branch in Nizhny Novgorod and Loan Treasury in Moscow. The story of a project for the projected Military Historical Museum began in 1899, when Emperor Nicholas II endorsed the idea of immortalizing the historical anniversaries of military events, already imminent at the onset of the 20th century. There was a proposal to erect the museum in St. Petersburg on the former Preobrazhensky Guards parade ground, between the church of Alexander Nevsky, built by Commander Alexander Suvorov at his estate Konchanskoye and transferred to St. Petersburg in 1900, and the Suvorov Museum designed by Alexander von Goguen in 1904. Altogether, this assembly of buildings was intended as a pantheon to the glory of Russian armaments, a church in memory of military events and prominent figures in Russian history. The Military Historical Museum itself was planned as a depository for documents and exhibits recounting the 1,000-year history of Kievan, Muscovite, and St. Petersburg periods of the Russian state. The Russo-Japanese War and administrative delays lengthened implementation of the Military Historical Museum building project, but on the 1st of July 1907, Nicholas II decided to recommence the interrupted work. The Emperor planned to open the new museum in time for the centenary of the Patriotic War of 1812. In June 1908, 6 projects were submitted to an open competition and exhibited for public viewing in the Suvorov Museum. The competition jury, including the architects Pomerantsev, Benoit, Suzor, Kintner, Kosyakov, and Stantsenko, awarded first prize to architect Vladimir Pokrovsky's project The Three Bogatirs, which was also recommended for implementation. Second prize in the competition went to a project in the traditions of Art Nouveau, with elements of the Russian style by Marian Peretyatkovich, the famous Russian architect, theoretician, town planner, and teacher. Third prize was awarded to St. Petersburg architect Siegfried Levy, whose project was designed in the Neo-Renaissance style. All that remained was for Pokrovsky's conceptually interesting and strikingly rendered project to be approved by the Emperor. Unfortunately, the expert commission's final choice was not supported by Nicholas II, who approved the project by architect of the Imperial Court Alexander von Goguen, designer of the Suvorov Museum. But this project was never realized either, maybe due to a lack of funding, and at that point the proposals for development of a military historical museum in St. Petersburg finally ended. Architect Vladimir Pokrovsky's drawings of the Military Historical Museum are almost fully represented in the Museum of Architecture's collection and consist of 30 items, beginning with his sketches and ending with the final version. In a general plan of the area, on the corner of Tavrichskaya, Tarida, and Kirochnaya streets, we can see the entire assemblage, where, in the center of the page, the location designated for the Military Historical Museum is heavily shaded, with the Suvorov Museum on the right and the small wooden Suvorov Konchanskoye church on the left, in a T shape. By its dimensions, the new museum considerably surpasses the Suvorov Museum beside it. Further expansion of the Military Historical Museum territory was also envisaged in the project, marked here by a dotted line. Architect Pokrovsky's final project for the museum is preceded by a series of pencil sketches depicting the early stage. In these, we can trace the search for a museum that could be constructed in the Russian style of the late Moscow period. Pokrovsky expressed the idea of the glory of Russian armaments in the forms and traditions of national architecture. Quite possibly, one prototype for the complex was the palace of Alexei Mikhailovich at the Kolomenskaya Tsars village. The planned project was realized in the form of an assembly of buildings similar to a Russian Kremlin or ancient fortified town, with wooden houses, inner courtyards and passages, and an artificial moat filled with water. Perspective plans of the structure are drawn on large-format cardboard with numerous staffage figures and artillery weapons. One of these drawings provides a bird's-eye view, a panorama of the entire museum ensemble. On the whole, the manner and stylistics of Pokrovsky's sketches are reminiscent of artist Ivan Bilibin's illustrations to Russian folk tales. The painstaking drawing of detail and color rendition of Pokrovsky's sketches testify to the mastery of the architect, who was a superb graphic artist. The facades are based on fortress architecture with the same style of Moscow Kremlin buildings as the Suvorov Museum. The decorative finishing of the facades in the form of open-work crowns and swallowtails, the parapets and ornate window frames outlined in bright red against the white walls are reminiscent of the Kutafia Tower in the Moscow Kremlin. In Pokrovsky's project, all the museum facades feature asymmetrical composition, with strikingly defined central volume and numerous towers. Roofs of various heights and shapes give the ensemble as a whole a picturesque character, as can be clearly seen in the perspective drawings. Each part of the assembly, and particularly the towers, has its own covering: conical, tent-shaped, pyramidal, hipped, or barreled. Part of the space and volume composition of the ensemble is provided by the 8 towers, the prototypes of which were the Spasskaya and Tsarskaya towers of the Moscow Kremlin, the towers at the Simonov Monastery, and other fortified structures. Probably the outer walls were to be faced with whitened brickwork, with decorative elements provided by curved red bricks. Let us now look at the layout structure and functional communications in the general plan. Pokrovsky's project complied with the assignment apart from a few minor discrepancies. The main entrance, with 2 asymmetrical towers, was meant to face Tavricheskaya Street. As seen from the general plan, the museum is an ensemble of various sized structures covered by separate roofs and grouped around an inner courtyard on a rectangular plot. The main chambers of the Military Historical Museum are arranged in a space with an inner courtyard, with an ensemble of exhibition rooms devoted to various periods of Russian history, from the time of the Grand Duchy to the rule of Nicholas II. All the rooms are named in honor of a ruler or important stage in history, and each exhibition hall has a separate space and its own particular roof structure. The arsenal, accentuated by a tall clock tower and connected to the main building by a passage, was assigned as a depository for military armaments and equipment, as well as models of monuments. According to the project, an additional auxiliary building linked to the entire ensemble was also envisaged in Pokrovsky's museum. By examining the internal space of the museum in the plans and sections, and also by studying clauses of the planned assignment, we can judge from several of the halls how they were meant to look and what would be exhibited there. All the exhibition interiors were designed to comply with the historical period they represented. The exhibition's overview of the 1,000-year military history of Russia began with the Time of the Grand Duchy Hall. Here, visitors would have seen wall maps showing the main battles and conflicts, pictures of battle scenes, and models of soldiers in uniform. The next room, a semicircle, was dedicated to the period Time of the Tsars. Here, there would be an exhibit featuring statues of outstanding historical figures, a collection of the weapons and equipment of the period, and war trophies. Next on the exhibition route, the viewer would encounter a rectangular chamber to represent the time of Peter I, with models of boats, maps, banners, statues, and portraits. In the center of this space, the project envisaged a model of the small boat and equestrian statue of Peter the Great. From this room, it would have been possible to traverse a tower and reach the arsenal, described in the project as section for the museum's larger objects. Here they intended to put most of the armaments and equipment from the Artillery Museum, some 20,000 items in total. As seen in the sketch, a grandiose composition with motifs of old Russian serf and church architecture would tower above the observer in the center of the arsenal space, which featured 2 tiers of windows. Returning to the main building, observers could proceed to the final hall on the ground floor, dedicated to the time of Elizabeth the Great and Paul I. Further on, ascending a staircase across the inner courtyard, viewers came to the vast halls of the first floor, with items covering the periods of Alexander I, Nicholas I, and Alexander II. Beyond these lay the final exposition with exhibits from the reigns of Alexander III and Nicholas II. The complex was also meant to include a meeting hall, which can be seen in the plan and section drawing on the right, in the semicircular space, with an amphitheatre. Today, the theme of exhibiting Russia's military history is equally relevant, more than 100 years later. Vladimir Pokrovsky's project for the Military Historical Museum is an interesting, even striking example of organization of a thematic exposition, a superb model for a grandiose structure in the neo-Russian style, preserved in the original authorial drawings and sketches.